Imagine you are standing on the shore of a quiet river in France. The year is 845. The morning is cold. The mist is still low on the water. And then you hear it. Not thunder, not wind. Something rhythmic. Something that does not stop. By the time you see the ships, it is already too late. That is how it began for hundreds of thousands of people across an entire continent. Not with an army marching through a gate. Not with a declaration of war. With ships. With silence. And then with fire. Here is what nobody tells you about the Vikings. They were not an empire. They had no unified king commanding 1,000,000 soldiers. No complex supply chain. No professional war ministry calculating logistics. What they had was something far more dangerous. A handful of men who understood something about human psychology that their enemies had completely forgotten. They understood that fear is a weapon, and they sharpened it better than any axe. The word Viking itself comes from the Old Norse word vik, meaning a bay or inlet. A Viking, in the original sense, was simply someone who emerged from the hidden places. Someone who came from where you were not looking. That is not a description of an ethnic group. It is a description of a method, and that method changed the shape of Europe. To understand how a relatively small number of raiders could paralyze an entire continent, you have to understand what Europe looked like in the late 700s. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was vast and powerful, yes, but it was also slow. Its armies moved on foot or horseback along roads that took weeks to traverse. Its communication systems were messengers on horses. By the time a lord received news of an attack and assembled his forces, the attackers were long gone. The Vikings understood this before any military strategist had put it into writing. Historian Neil Price, who has spent decades excavating and analyzing Viking-age sites across Scandinavia and Europe, describes what he calls the Vikings' core strategic advantage as radical mobility. They could strike, vanish, and reappear somewhere completely unexpected within days. Their longships drew so little water that they could sail up rivers that military planners assumed were impossible to navigate. They could cross open ocean. They could be beached directly on a shore without a harbor. They were not just ships. They were the most sophisticated military transport technology of the early medieval world. But here is where it gets stranger. Here is where the psychological weapon enters. The first major Viking raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 was not just an attack. It was a message. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest sites in the Christian world. It was considered untouchable, protected not by walls or soldiers, but by its sacred status. When the Vikings hit it anyway, when they walked into that sanctified space and took everything they wanted, the message to all of Christian Europe was simple and devastating. Nowhere is safe. Historian Michael Livingston, who has written extensively on early medieval warfare, argues that the psychological impact of Lindisfarne was disproportionate to the actual material loss. The monks who were killed numbered in the dozens. The treasure stolen was significant but not world-altering. What was destroyed was something far more valuable. The psychological assumption that certain places were exempt from violence. Once that assumption broke, it never fully repaired itself. And the Vikings pressed that wound deliberately. They hit monasteries specifically because monasteries were wealthy, poorly defended, and symbolically important. They raided during festivals because that was when populations were gathered and defenses were relaxed. They struck in the early morning, in the fog, at the mouths of rivers no one expected them to use. Every choice was calibrated to maximize the effect of surprise. Every choice was designed to make the next attack feel inevitable before it even happened. This is what military theorists now call an asymmetric strategy. A smaller force generating effects wildly disproportionate to its actual size by targeting the enemy's psychology rather than its army. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. The raid on Paris in 845, led by a Viking chieftain known as Ragnar, involved a fleet of around 120 ships. Historians estimate that this force numbered somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men. Paris at that time had a population of perhaps 20 to 30,000. And yet the Frankish king Charles the Bald, rather than fight, paid Ragnar 7,000 pounds of silver to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver. to fewer than 5,000 men. That is not a military failure. That is a psychological collapse. But why did it work so completely? Why did experienced rulers with professional armies and fortified cities simply fold in front of forces that were, objectively, outnumbered? The answer lies in something that military psychologist Dave Grossman has documented extensively in his work on the history of killing and human threat response. When an attack is unpredictable, when it can come from any direction at any time with no warning, the human nervous system does not simply register a threat. It registers a threat that cannot be prepared for. And a threat that cannot be prepared for triggers a fundamentally different cognitive state than a threat you can see coming. It is not fear of the specific attack. It is fear of the uncertainty itself. It is not fear of the specific attack. It is fear of the uncertainty itself. And uncertainty, Grossman's research confirms, is more psychologically disabling than the actual danger. The Vikings did not just attack. They created a state of permanent vigilance that exhausted entire populations before a single longship appeared on the horizon. In England, the Danes extracted a payment system so regularized that it got its own name, the Danegeld, a tax paid not for any specific service but purely to buy peace from an enemy that might or might not appear. At its peak, the Danegeld extracted enormous quantities of silver from the English population, year after year, to fund an enemy that was not even actively raiding at the time. The threat alone had become economically productive for the Vikings. Think about that. They were generating income from people they were not even attacking. And then something happened that military historians find remarkable. The Vikings began to stop. Not because they were defeated. Not because Europe finally built defenses they could not penetrate, though some of that helped. But because the very success of their strategy began to change who they were. When you raid a place once, you take wealth. When you raid it repeatedly, you begin to control it. When you control it, you need administrators. You need relationships. You need to become, in some sense, part of the thing you were raiding. The Vikings who settled in Normandy, in England, in Ireland, in Sicily, in Russia, did not abandon their culture. But they wove it into something new. They became farmers, traders, lords, kings. Historian Judith Jesch, one of the leading scholars of Norse literature and runic inscriptions, has argued that the popular image of the Viking as a purely destructive force misses the more complicated truth. The same networks that carried raiders also carried merchants. The same men who burned a monastery in one decade might found a trading post in the next. Violence and commerce in the Viking Age were not opposites. They were tools in the same kit, deployed depending on what the situation rewarded. This is the part that should make you pause. Because the Vikings were not uniquely violent for their time. The Frankish armies were brutal. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were brutal. What made the Vikings exceptional was not their capacity for violence but their flexibility. Their willingness to be whatever the situation required. Raiders when raiding paid. Traders when trading paid. Settlers when settling paid. They did not have an ideology of conquest. They had a strategy of maximum adaptability. And that strategy, executed by forces that were almost always numerically smaller than their targets, reshaped the political map of an entire continent. The Duchy of Normandy, the Kingdom of England after 1066, because William the Conqueror was himself a descendant of Viking settlers. The Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, the most elite military unit in the medieval world, composed almost entirely of Norse warriors. The trade routes from Scandinavia to Constantinople and Baghdad that moved silver, furs, and slaves across thousands of miles of river and sea. All of this from a handful of men in ships. The next time someone tells you that size determines outcome, that the larger force always wins, that a small group of determined people cannot change the world by understanding something their enemies have forgotten, remember the mist on the river. Remember the rhythmic sound. Remember that by the time you see the ships, it is already too late. Because the most dangerous thing on a battlefield is never the weapon in someone's hand. It is the thought they planted in your mind before they ever arrived. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an adventure with Doodler Historian. Got a fascinating battle, legendary general, or bizarre moment from history you'd like us to cover? Let me know in the comments below. Until then, keep your curiosity sharp, your history books open, and I'll see you in the next story. Farewell, historians.